right, so good afternoon and welcome everyone to the fourth and final virtual meeting of the Northern Tier Passenger Rail Study Working Group. My name is Michaela Niles. I'm the Mass DOT project manager for this effort, and I'm joined today by members of the consultant team. I'd like to thank you all for joining us and thank our working group members in attendance, including the elected officials on the call today. So before we launch into the presentation itself, I'd like to open with a few procedures for today's meeting on the next slide. So first, working group members will have the opportunity to ask questions and share comments at points during the presentation. To participate, you may use the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, or if you're participating by phone, you can dial *9. We will then call your name so that you may share your comment or question. We ask that you please keep your microphone muted unless speaking, and ask that all speakers please begin by stating your name, and this will benefit everyone, especially those who are participating by phone today. Working group members will be able to share their video. You can keep your video on or off, but the main request is to minimize distractions for others who are viewing the presentation. And members of the public in attendance may submit comments or questions at any time in writing using the Q&A, and meeting staff will address them as time allows at the end of the presentation. To view closed captions, you can do so by clicking the closed captions feature and selecting either show subtitle or view full transcript. Show subtitle will display captions at the bottom of the screen, and view full transcript will display the meeting's audio transcription in a window to the right. And if you need any technical assistance at all, please contact Zoom technical support at 888-799-9666. And before we get into the presentation, the next slide gets into a little bit more of the kind of procedures for today's meeting. So please note that this meeting is being recorded. The Massachusetts Department of Transportation may choose to retain and distribute the video, still images, audio, and/or chat and Q&A transcripts. And by continuing attendance with this virtual meeting, you are consenting to participate in a recorded event. All recordings and chat transcripts will be considered a public record. And if you're not comfortable being recorded, please turn off your camera, keep your microphone muted, and refrain from utilizing the Q&A. And finally, all comments and questions are welcome and appreciated. We do request, however, that folks refrain from any disrespectful comments. And now moving to today's agenda. We will provide an overview of the study process and review the study alternatives. And from there, we'll present issues and opportunities for consideration, as well as draft recommended next steps and the draft implementation plan. And then we'll open up the floor for working group discussion. And finally, we'll open up the floor for public comment and outline next steps for the study. So now moving to a bit of background as the study overview. And the next slide talks a little bit about the background of this effort. So the Massachusetts legislature directed Mass DOT to conduct a study of the feasibility of rail access between North Adams and Boston. And in fulfillment of this directive, this conceptual planning study seeks to assess the economic and environmental benefits, as well as any associated implementation challenges, and identify all necessary improvements to support restored passenger rail service along the Northern Tier. And this next slide talks about the study process itself. And this chart, many of you have seen this many times. This chart outlines the study tasks, with each step building upon the previous one, with public participation serving as a foundation of the study, which has been carried throughout. And today we'll be discussing the development of recommended next steps, and that's task 7. And at the conclusion of this task, the study process will be documented in a final draft final report, which will then be released for public comment and then finalized in the final report. And on the next slide, we kind of talk a little bit about, or cover rather, the study goals and objectives that were developed based on feedback received at the onset of the study. And so these goals are to support economic development along the corridor, to promote transportation equity, and to minimize impacts of transportation on public health and the environment. And so with that, I will now hand it over to Anna Berry, project manager for the consultant team. Anna?
Good afternoon and welcome. We're now going to talk about the study alternatives and review those. Looking at the next slide, I think you'll all remember that a key part of this process of studying the feasibility is to develop service alternatives, different ways of providing service along the corridor. And in this project, we developed the alternatives in two phases. And as you'll recall, during the first phase, we developed two alternatives, a lower investment alternative and one with a higher investment. We then had a public workshop with all of you and developed feedback and evaluations of those two alternatives, looking at the entire process with a smaller set of alternatives, and then took that feedback and experience and translated it into four alternatives that show different features to a possible rail service. So in the next several slides, we show what these alternatives were. Alternative one was, as I mentioned, a lower investment, which involves developing a service of 5 trains a day with 4 stations, North Adams, Greenfield, Fitchburg, and North Station. We've increased speeds at some critical locations and provide a little bit of double track in this lower investment alternative, but it was all the minimum required to develop a basic train service so we could see what a lower investment would provide, what type of service that would provide. The next alternative was a higher investment alternative, which I had the same stations and the same 5 trains a day, but involved more investment in terms of track speeds, higher speeds in more locations, as well as a number of locations of double track to provide more an enhanced service coming from that higher investment. Again, the same basic investments in bridges and signals, but with I should have mentioned earlier, there's a layover yard in North Adams in both of these alternatives where the trains would park overnight before beginning service in the morning. But this higher investment service was intended to give us the opportunity to see what more infrastructure would give us in terms of service quality, and outcomes. When we went to phase 2, we developed 4 more alternatives. The next one is alternative 3. Alternative 3 is an electrified service with overhead catenary system between Fitchburg and North Adams, providing the higher speed service that's available with electrified service. And with this, we also took the opportunity in this alternative to add stations at Athol, Air, and Porter Square Station. All of the alternatives in phase 2 include Porter Square because that seemed to be a pretty unanimous feedback from the public after the workshop and review process that we engaged. And the rest of the alternatives have basically similar type of investments, additional double track, increasing speeds, most of them consistent with that higher investment level, but just in different locations based on what the configuration of the service with electrification would require. And the next alternative 4 is what we call full local service, where we add stations in Shelburne Falls, Athol, Gardner, as well as Porter. And in addition, we have the same investments, increasing speeds and providing double track in the appropriate locations consistent with that higher investment level. And with additional stations to provide additional coverage areas for customers using the service. The next alternative is one that a number of people had expressed interest in during the feedback that we received, and that is an extension to Albany, New York. So with the basic stations we started with, North Adams, Greenfield, Fitchburg, North Station, we have Porter, and in New York, 2 stations in Albany and Schenectady. We have the same investment levels in Massachusetts. However, in the New York State region, we've just assumed a certain amount of double track that would be required to operate passenger service over the freight lines that we would be using. We also assumed that we would be able to use the track terminal in Albany instead of using a North Adams layover. And again, the investment level for double track and speeds is about consistent with the higher investment level of the original alternatives. Alternative 6 is what we call the Northern Tier Rail Link, that in which trains would travel from North Adams through the Greenfield and Athol to Fitchburg, and then customers coming and going to the west would change trains at Fitchburg for trips going to or coming from Boston. So the trains would stop at Fitchburg and either pick up or passengers would detrain. So this has a similar level of investment and one additional station in Athol. Of course, on the other end of the line, the Fitchburg line already stops in Fitchburg, as well as a number of other locations in between. And at this point, my colleague Paul Nelson will talk us through the various valuation points of the alternatives that we developed for you in this project.
Thanks, Anna. So it's up to me to walk you all through these eye charts that we have, and we're providing these as a comparison between the 6 alternatives and the criteria that we looked at that are all based on the overall goals and objectives for the study. So there's a few of these, and I'll walk you through them. Primarily, in this part, you can see across the top, we've got alternatives 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 across the top with the different attributes of it. So you can see that all 6 alternatives had the same daily frequency of trains with 5 trains per day. As Anna discussed in sharing the maps, the coverage areas differ based on the stations that are provided, and here they're listed out as shown in the maps. Maybe the one thing that's kind of new information as far as the comparison among these these 6, excuse me, are the eastbound travel times, and the westbound travel times are comparable, but we wanted to do this to provide an example of the difference between those. And you can see that the most stark difference is between the lower investment and the higher investment. And you can see that without the investment in the upgrading the track class for most of the corridor, you do have a longer ride by about an hour between North Adams and Boston at 3 hours and 48 minutes. And you can see as soon as you upgrade that track to allow faster operating speeds, you can cut that down to about 2 hours and 48 minutes. And that's pretty consistent across the alternatives 2, 3, 4, and 5. It's a little bit longer for alternative 4 just because of the number of stations it serves. And then you can see in the Northern Tier Rail Link, this is where the transfer at Fitchburg and the slower progress of the MBTA commuter rail trains increases the runtime. Next category, and comparable relationship between travel times in Greenfield to Boston are highlighted below that. As far as the maximum allowable speeds, they all are pretty consistent across here. I think the one thing I want to point out is as the travel times show, in the first alternative, you can only reach those maximum allowable speeds for a smaller length of the corridor overall, smaller segments on the corridor, where in 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, it's more widespread throughout it. Environmental impacts have all been rated as similar and in a minimal category, primarily because all of the alternatives maintain use of the existing right-of-way and don't move into new alignments where there'd be potentially more impacts. The passenger rail impacts with a frequency of 5 trains per day, we were able to schedule those so that they would avoid the windows. They would actually pass between the MBTA commuter rail trains. So we're anticipating no passenger rail impacts in all 6 of the alternatives. And then for freight rail impacts, we have estimated that there's minimal delay in the Pan Am Southern segments. That's the North Adams through Fitchburg, and then also in the segments into Boston. You'll note that the Albany extension, we did not look at delays or any disruptions west of North Adams. And then finally, the comparison of kind of community and safety impacts is quantifying the number of at-grade crossings. And you can see because they have a similar extent, all the alternatives except alternative 5 have 69 crossings, where there's more crossings in the Albany option because it extends through New York and Vermont. And you can see, just as a note for the travel times, what we sought in the higher investment alternative and the subsequent alternatives was a travel time that was competitive with driving. And so here you can see an accounting of what those travel times are from the INRIX data and other sources we were able to look at. Next slide, please. So then this is a little bit more of the numbers related to outcomes of the service. You can see that the estimated ridership is shown first. And for this analysis, we looked at both a low and a high estimate of annual ridership. And so here, and what we found in the process that we followed was that travel time and how it compares to auto travel time was a big driver of ridership. That's why you see lower ridership, especially in alternative 1 and in alternative 6, you can see that the alternatives 2, 3, 4, and 5 all have higher ridership than those, and that it reaches its peak in the alternative 3 and 4, where you see the benefit of slightly better travel times and more station locations. What we found in the analysis is that the more stations provided, the more ridership you get. You're drawing more people to the service. As far as the capital cost per mile, that's something where we take the ridership number that's shown above. And, oh, excuse me, not the ridership, capital cost per mile, the length of the corridor, and divide it by the construction cost, just to look at how it looks on a more even basis for some of the corridor that's longer, like the Albany alternative. And this is where you see, again, a pretty comparable cost for the big jump is from, from alternative 1 up to alternatives 2, 4, 5, and 6, where you see relatively comparable costs. Here, the Albany connector is shown as less expensive per mile because so much of the mileage in Albany and in New York and Vermont is not improved. So you're not seeing the same investment on a per mile basis. And this is also where it shows the added cost of the electrification and when its impact on a per mile basis. Then the second cost figure here is the capital cost per rider. And again, this is where the ridership is related to the overall cost. So you're starting to see, the general comparison here. And again, just to go back to the alternative 6, where you can see the impact of that lower ridership, especially on that very high capital cost under the low situation. And the phenomenon that's happening here is really the penalty of waiting to transfer and then the slower service. So what we had to factor into estimating that ridership was the idea that the way the Fitchburg station is laid out, the Northern Tier train, in the way it's designed, would have to come in, drop people off, then move out of the way so that the MBTA train could come and serve the same platform. So that's a longer time to wait, and there's a pretty stiff penalty for users of the service, and that's why you're seeing the ridership drop off. And then similarly, we have an operating and maintenance cost per rider, and that's all tied to the equipment that's necessary to run on the service by the ridership. And you can see a similar relationship between the maintenance cost per rider and the capital cost per rider, given the strong role that the ridership shows. Transportation cost savings were also something we wanted to calculate, and this was transportation cost savings is savings to drivers who were taking these trips by car previously and now would be able to take the train. And so there's a reduced cost to them in wear and tear in their vehicle, kind of the mileage rate. And then also for those trips destined for Boston, we incorporated a daily parking cost for each trip. And that's what you're seeing amplified here and calculated as transportation cost savings. And then we also looked at annual VMT reductions. Again, this is the same thing, getting cars off the road and what that means for reduction in vehicle miles traveled as a whole. And so same phenomenon plays out here. The more ridership you see on the longer distance trips, the more VMT you see reduced. So you see a similar relationship, really, again, with the highest VMT reduction in the electrified service and the full local service, and the lowest in the alternative 1 lower investment and the Northern Tier rail link. And then economic impacts from construction. This is a look at how the potential for these projects when they're constructed to have a greater economic impact. And that's really just taking the dollars spent on the construction cost and how it multiplies and propagates through the economy. So we estimated that, and the one difference between the alternatives is that we anticipated alternative 1, because it's a lower level of investment, would be the construction period would only be 3 years versus the 4 years for the other alternatives. And so you can see that the output in millions is shown here, and it's greater for the more expensive projects. And then what those look like is actually jobs created. And I wanted to note that that's the direct jobs, indirect jobs, and induced. And the breakdown of that is the employees working directly on the project. Then the indirect are those that are basically supplying that construction job. And then the induced is the money from that, from those wages spread out, being used in other elements of the economy. Next slide, please. And so here is, again, just revisiting the total costs from a capital construction cost perspective and the annual operations and maintenance cost and how they play out. So just that comparison, these were also shown on the maps that showed the different alternatives. But to revisit that, you had, one by one, you had alternative one with the lower investment at an estimated total cost of $878 million. The higher investment at $1.5 billion. The electrified service was about twice that at just under $3 billion. And most of that added cost being tied to the electrification, the construction of the catenary wire and power systems, substations, things like that to power it. And then you have the full local service having a pretty similar cost to the higher investment. And then the Albany extension, where the added cost over alternatives 2 and 4 really is that double tracking in the New York segments. And then the Northern Tier Rail Link has a similar cost to the others because you're still upgrading basically the Pan Am Southern part of the network at the same level. And then how those shake out on operations maintenance. You can see that they all start from a similar baseline because it's primarily based on the equipment that would be running how many train sets. And so you can see that we have the same number of train sets operating for alternatives 1 through 4. We have more train sets operating for alternative 5 because there's a longer distance to keep that 5 trains per day. And then the Northern Tier Rail Link with its shorter run route, you don't have to operate as much equipment there. And then how that pans out for each rider on an annual basis. All right, and I think I've got one more eye chart for you. One of the things that we did here was we performed a benefit cost analysis. And one of the things I want to note is that this is, we've throughout this study, we've talked of the potential benefits and drawbacks of added passenger rail service. And I just want to say that, the guidelines for benefit cost analysis are pretty strict. They're dictated by the federal government. We wanted to follow through their grant program. So we wanted to follow that procedure for this to make sure we could really judge this on an apples to apples basis to other projects. So it does not necessarily, and the big part of those regulations is that they don't allow some of the other benefits that we might want to think about that could happen. So it's really a standardized approach. And so that's why some of these may not pen out as much as you think they might have had. But what I'll do is I'll walk you through these numbers and what they mean for one of the alternatives, and we can see how it applies to all of them. So just looking at alternative 1, the way you start this out is understanding the operations and maintenance. So that's where the total operations and maintenance is given a net present value, and it's a cost. Then you see that there are safety benefits to this service, and that's primarily people going off the road who no longer are exposed to potentially getting in crashes or anything like that. So there is a marginal increase in safety for people. Avoided road wear and tear. It's really kind of not much of a difference because, even though there is a reduction in VMT when compared to the total VMT on Route 2 is a relatively small amount. Avoided congestion. Again, you're seeing the benefit of those cars off the road and out of congestion. Then we have 2 metrics for avoided emissions. And the first one shows that basically the way I would show this is as a negative number. It shows that with relatively low ridership, the train service, basically the non-CO2 pollution from a diesel-powered train isn't enough to offset what was avoided by the switching to the train service. But you can see that on the CO2 side, there is the benefit across the board. Property value increase. This was a look at basically incorporating the concept that the properties within a half mile of the stations would see an increase in value given the construction of a new train station with daily service. And so that's what you can see there. I'll just note that for alternative 4, it's markedly higher than the others because there are so many stations. That's the case where the more stations you have, the more economic impact because there's just more land value attached to them. But what you can see is that the total benefits end up being negative. And then when you compare that to the total cost, you get a net present value that's also negative and resulting in these benefit cost ratio values shown. And what we've noted here is that, a ratio of 1.0 or higher makes a project more competitive for discretionary grants under the current federal rules. But it is but it is provided here because it is a method of evaluating against each other. So the least bad here is the alternative 3 with the negative 0.1. All right, we'll go on, and then I think just sum up the overall evaluation of the different alternatives. So our key takeaways to share with you, what we're kind of seeing as the consultant team and with MassDOT is that all alternatives, estimate to provide connectivity, mobility, and choice. This would all offer new service to the communities in the corridor that are served by stations. All alternatives are estimated to provide positive environmental and economic impacts. That's what you could see, especially in the benefit cost analysis. And that alternative 3, the electrified service, and alternative 4, the full local service, generate the highest levels of ridership and all of the measurements that flow from that, including transportation cost savings and VMT reduction. And now I will give it back to Anna.
Thank you, Paul. We're now going to move on and talk about some of the issues and opportunities by the alternatives and the evaluation process that we engaged in here. Going to the next slide, one of the issues that arose and was resolved during the duration of our study was the question of governance for intercity passenger rail services in Massachusetts. The Western Massachusetts Passenger Rail Commission convened with the mission of vetting the call for a new public entity to build and manage intercity passenger rail serving Western Massachusetts. There was a diverse membership, including some of the folks on this call, I think, who were reviewed and the issues, attended several public meetings out in the western part of the state. And the commission recently, in the last couple of months, issued a report concluding that MassDOT is the agency that should be responsible for the development, construction, procurement, and oversight of both existing and future passenger rail service in Massachusetts, Western Mass, and other towns within the Commonwealth. So this is seems to establish that going forward, if there were a Northern Tier service, it would be developed under the aegis of MassDOT, as some of the other services are today. So moving on, we also, during the lifetime of this study, saw the unveiling of a new approach and branding for MassDOT on its intercity passenger rail program. Rather than talking about east-west and north-south, MassDOT wants to have an all-inclusive approach that they're calling Compass Rail, Commonwealth Passenger Rail, but also including all points of the compass. So this is intercity rail, not commuter rail. And it also includes a very robust build out that's going on now at Springfield Union Station. And this program is administered by MassDOT Rail and Transit Division, but all of the services that are the intercity passenger rail services are provided in partnership with Amtrak as the operator and with CSX as in some cases the owner, and with the states of Connecticut, New York, and Vermont, who also are partnering on various services such as the Hartford Line and the Vermonter. We then move on to talk about some of the other issues that are common to intercity passenger rail services, also opportunities. MassDOT will have to consider agreements with Pan Am Southern and its operator, the Berkshire and Eastern Railroad, which provides the freight service on Pan Am Southern now. And they would also have to consider an agreement with the MBTA for access to the Fitchburg line between Fitchburg and Boston. In the intercity passenger rail business, the railroads that are the owners are known as the host railroads, and they generally seek to negotiate terms with the passenger rail sponsors, such as MassDOT, for access for passenger trains. They want to provide that access with terms that protect their finances, their property, and the services they operate from any of the impacts of passenger rail service. When you put more trains on any track, there's the potential for delays and complications. So host railroads tend to want to insulate themselves from any negative impacts through these agreements. But we need to note that both a passenger rail operator, which in this case would be Amtrak, and the host railroad have to consent for service. They have to agree to service, and they have to be involved and agree to the effort to obtain federal funds. USDOT, Federal Railroad Administration, will not give federal funds to host agencies, rather sponsoring agencies, who have not gotten all of the necessary partners to agree on a service. And looking at a little more detail on what host railroads look for, they generally want the passenger rail sponsor to take responsibility for all of the cost, capital cost and operating and maintenance cost. They want that state sponsor to be responsible for insurance and any other costs that arise from liability issues. Now, having Amtrak as an operator can make some of this a little easier. It can limit some of the costs because Amtrak has a statutory right under federal law to access any other railroad's property. And that may limit some of the cost, but it doesn't eliminate the need for a negotiation and to come to an agreement on what those costs are. Finally, though, the passenger rail sponsors, such as Mass DOT, in this negotiation will try to negotiate terms that optimize both the safety and the service quality of the passenger rail service that's going to be offered. This often takes negotiating with the host railroad in order to manage the service in a way that optimizes performance. If the host railroad is a freight railroad and they have a choice of operating a freight train or a passenger train, they need to have some incentive or other means to induce them to let that passenger train run on its schedule. So the sponsor may want to negotiate incentives and or penalties to make sure the trains run on time. At the same time, all railroads have to operate under the minimum safety requirements of the Federal Railroad Administration. However, a passenger rail operator may want to enhance some of the requirements through that host railroad agreement. They may want additional programs for safety. They may want additional safety reports, and this would be negotiated through the access agreement. The next set of issues that we would talk about are the potential for increases in infrastructure, construction, and maintenance cost. We have, in our estimates, tried to account for the cost, and when you have unknowns in cost estimating, you use contingencies to cover some of those unknowns. However, looking at the assets we have in front of us, we do know that Pan Am Southern is an important strategic asset for the Commonwealth. It provides freight service and resiliency and redundancy for freight service on the east-west direction of Massachusetts. That asset does include the Hoosick Tunnel, which has significant state of good repair issues. So it's conceivable that if there were a program for improvement of the Hoosick Tunnel, there could be service outages in that because it's a single track through the tunnel. We also have some other unknowns. The information we receive in the future about bridges and other infrastructure may inflate costs. Hopefully our contingencies are cover them, but we just like to note, there's still the possibility for costs being higher than what we've estimated so far in this planning study. Now I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Paul.
Thanks, Anna. I just want to highlight a few additional issues and opportunities that we identified here. And the first one I'll talk about is the current population projections. As you saw when I walked through the evaluation, the ridership really plays a big part in how this service is evaluated from a number of different metrics. And so, one of the facts that that is reflected in the ridership is that the population in the western segment of the corridor is projected to decline, and the central segment is only forecasted to have modest growth, and that's based on the statewide, assessment of growth and population and employment trends. And so I think that there is an opportunity to look into that more closely and see if there's been any influence from pandemic-induced changes on populations or potential travel patterns that could lead to additional evaluation that would revise those, or maybe talk about a different inclination towards rail transportation than what we could see in the data available. And that could partner with, future rail service to encourage other forms of growth in the corridor, that are outside of kind of the original estimate that we had. Next slide. The other one too is that, the transportation and rail service especially is at the intersection of housing and transportation, and looking at that. So in a situation where, we could find reason to back up the fact that, additional relocation could occur to the corridor for this type of rail service, other supporting infrastructure and housing concern issues should also be addressed and planned for, beyond just the station location. But if we found reason to think that, migration into the region would happen, how would that look from the community's master planning and zoning around their stations? How would the other city services look if it was a substantial number of people? Are they prepared to do that? And then going a little bit further into as rail service is introduced, could other trends follow on that kind of follow the rail service? So college corridors, university transportations could look at other ways to encourage people to travel. Tourism could be a little different, and shift its existing behaviors as well. Next slide. And what we did want to raise, although I did point in the BCA slide to the fact that the current rating for these projects as a whole would not be competitive for federal funds, there is always the hope that certain segments of the preferred alternative could be competitive for the different types of grants, because what you can see here is that there are US DOT grants for a number of different goals and purposes, and we've seen information about how some of the goals of the Albany, Pittsfield, Springfield, Worcester, Boston corridor have been brought forward through grant awards under the CRISI program and things like that. So, these should still be thought of as potential vehicles for, some parts of the improvements in the line as the recommended steps are followed. So just a quick rundown of those is you do have the CRISI grant, which is the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements Program. And we've got a kind of a brief overview, but that's meant to emphasize safety, efficiency, and reliability of intercity passenger and freight rail. You've got the programs under the Federal State Partnership for Intercity Passenger Rail, and that's really being used extensively around the country for startup of new passenger service, but it can also address state of good repair backlog, looking to improve performance in existing corridors as well. Then you have some of the more broad grant programs such as MEGA, which is officially called the National Infrastructure Project Assistance Program. This is looking at large complex projects that are likely to generate national or regional economic mobility or safety benefits. There's the Nationally Significant Multimodal Freight and Highway Projects, the INFRA program, again, looking at projects with a national or regional significance to improve safety, efficiency, and reliability of the movement of freight and people. And so here, some of these things, knowing that the corridor is used by freight, and then we're looking at the expansion into passenger use, could be a benefit for some of these programs. There's the Rural Surface Transportation Grant Program, which is meant to improve and expand the surface transportation infrastructure in rural areas. There's the Railroad Crossing Elimination Grant Program. Again, this is something where, increasing the train speeds in this corridor would need changes at these railroad crossings. So maybe we could look at the benefits of eliminating some of them, depending on how access around those rails work. There's rebuilding the American infrastructure and sustainability and equity with sustainability and equity. That's the RAISE grants. And these cover all sorts of all modes of transportation projects that promise to achieve national objectives. And then there's the Restoration and Enhancement Program, which covers operating costs of new passenger train services. That's the funding declines from 92% to 30% as the service gets on its feet and builds awareness for passengers. Next slide, please. And then also potential funding opportunities to be cognizant of at other levels besides the federal level. There are state funding programs looking at, capital projects funding through the state bond cap or direct legislation appropriation authorization. There's the Commonwealth Rail Enhancement Program, which covers the programs there. It's funded from those. And then, looking at opportunities for local funding and financing programs, especially in areas where, there's a potential station location and an interaction between, say, the station and the local RTA or other modes of transportation. You can look at some of these, especially value capture, local contributions to regional agencies, joint development, transit-oriented development, all of those as potential options. Next slide, please. And then, now I forget, Anna, do you get this or Michaela? I think I forgot this last time too.
That's
Michaela.
me, Paul.
Okay.
Yes. So as based on the findings from the study and the input that we've received over the course of this effort, we have been working to develop some draft recommended next steps that are listed on this next slide here. So this slide lists 7 draft recommended next steps, and these recommended next steps include continuing to improve our understanding of travel demand along the northern tier and links to key destinations, and continuing to advance planning efforts related to economic development needs and opportunities, including at potential station locations. In addition, other recommended next steps include exploring different service types, such as scheduled motor coach service to destinations along the corridor, alternative phasing options or implementation strategies, as well as evaluating the potential for express service between Fitchburg and Boston. And a couple of other recommended next steps include monitoring freight trends along the corridor to explore needs and opportunities for investment in infrastructure, and developing strategies for improving rail connections within the corridor in alignment with the study's goals of supporting economic development, transportation equity, and minimizing impacts to public health and the environment. And on this next couple of slides, we start talking a little bit about the draft implementation plan. So one of the more common questions that we've received relates to potential timelines for implementation. So to address this question, we wanted to provide a bit of an overview of the Federal Railroad Administration's project development process, which is a 6-step process that involves systems planning, project development, final design, construction, and then finally operation. And the Northern Tier passenger rail study would fall under the earliest stage of this overall project development process. And the next slide addresses a little bit of the potential timeline. So it illustrates a sample timeline, which includes various steps in advance of operation. And that includes securing funding, coordination with the host railroads and the passenger rail operator, advancing further planning and more in-depth modeling, any engineering, environmental permitting that would be needed, construction, as well as hiring and training employees that would be working on the service. And so with all of that, we will now move to the working group discussion portion. So on the next slide, we have a couple of questions for the working group listed on this next slide that asks about just any general comments or questions about the alternatives evaluation. And in addition to that, we'd also like to get your input on what next steps you would suggest upon completion of this study. So at this time, we'd like to open up the floor for the working group. You should all have the ability to unmute yourselves. So if you have any comments or questions at this time, please raise your virtual hand. I see a raised hand from Jackson.
Yes, thank you. This is Jackson Morado. I'm attending on behalf of Jared Johnson from Transit Matters. And one question I had is it looked like you were looking at class 4 track as the maximum on the segment. I was curious if you had considered looking at class 5 track and whether there would be any ridership benefits there?
Anna or Paul?
We tried to implement reasonable increases in speed and track condition, and we didn't on the freight side of this really go beyond class 4. At this stage, it seemed as if for the length of track we were talking about, and the amount of investment we're talking about, we wanted to keep it reasonable, and class 4 seemed reasonable.
I next see a
Thank you.
raised hand from Kevin.
All right, here we go. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Kevin Lynch, Norfolk Southern. Appreciate everybody, the invite to this. We've not, this is something we're just learning about now. We got the invite last week, so we are happy to be included. I don't believe we're prepared to talk on the particulars that all the details I went through today, but I think it's important to note that the Norfolk Southern has an ownership stake in the Pan Am Southern. So I believe that's important to keep in mind when working through this. Is not just CSX up there. Norfolk Southern is also one of the host railroads that is needed to progress this forward. But just wanted to make that again. Happy to be included and great meet everybody. But yeah, just wanted to raise that point.
Great, thank you. Are there any other comments or questions from the working group? I see a raised hand from Dan.
Yes, how you doing? Thank you so much, Dan Rivera from Mass Development. Just a question about the grants that you talked about. Is there, you listed them all pretty well. The question is is there grants, how much they grant out for each one of those rounds, creating kind of a capital stack of, possible grant dollars to fund this versus what is the gap? And see some of those numbers, it seems like a very possible number to get to, but if you could align those two, like, hey, this is what it would cost, but here's a capital stack of federal grant programs that could get you someplace that way it can inform all the decision makers on true costs.
Well, there is some effort yet to be undertaken before this project could actually look at additional grant applications. Some additional planning and other activities are necessary. Some of these federal program, a lot of these FRA programs tend to be somewhat irregular in how they're issued. So at any moment in time, it's a bit of a challenge to see exactly what's ahead. But I think it's fair to say the project needs to be advanced in some planning, start to limit the alternatives to determine what projects actually you would be looking to fund. And then you could start to focus on how you would start to organize and plan for the various federal grants. I don't know if Michaela has some additional views on that, but that's how I've.
No, thank you, Anna, and thank you for the question. I next see a raised hand from Representative Barrett.
Yes, thank you, Michaela. I guess my concern is that when I left last time we met, I had some optimism on when this was going to be completed and everything. What I've seen today is a repeat of some of the things that we've talked about prior to this gathering today, and now I see more things that have been added, additional studies. This study was supposed to have ended, taken 18 months. Now we're into what, 24, 25 months? I don't know. It keeps going on. And, we're looking for some type of a final report, and things keep to be added to it, which is bothersome to me, and I think to a lot of others. And questions are now being risen here that just weren't on anybody's radar screen. We knew about the housing. We knew about the importance of the economic development to our area. We knew, and when I say our area, from Fitchburg west You know, I've even seen recent talk in the last month or so about just ending it in Greenfield. We already hopefully had decided that going into Albany wasn't a wise decision. That would be for the east-west corridor. And what we were attempting to do on this is to improve the economies along this stretch. Right now, it stops in Fitchburg. Housing, yes, now they're worried about bringing up study of housing and the concerns the communities have to make to create housing if stations are there. I mean, come on, we knew that. I mean, this is getting absurd now. This is another typical report that's never going to be finished here. And it's got to come to some conclusion at some point. But most importantly is that, you know, we should be included in the compact that that everyone is talked about in dealing with passenger service out here and the importance of it, and how best to do it. We talked about electrification. We talked about the costs. I didn't hear any real cost estimates today. We had talked anywhere from $1.5 billion without electrification, but planning for it in the end. We've talked a lot about these things. And I'm tired of the talk, to be very honest with you. And I want to see something done. I want to begin to look at this. We now are talking about the problems with the Hoosick Tunnel. We talked about that a year ago, that there was possibilities for it. We talked about the things that Mr. Lynch had brought up, you know, about the different types of who would operate it, where would the money come from, and types like this. There is a real problem in this state with environmental concerns and also transportation from east-west or west-east. In the northern tier, two counties in this state have lost population over the past 20 years, basically, and that's Franklin County and Berkshire County. And there has to be some type of linkage. Go back in the history, you can see when we boomed in this area out in the western part of the state here, it was because we had decent rail service, and it made a difference. And I think we have to start looking at that now. But most importantly, when the hell are we going to finish this thing? I mean, you know, those are the things that have to be answered. If I didn't question and bring this to the governor's attention, I mean, Michaela sends me an email that basically says, after we asked, when's the final report going to be on? Well, we've got to do some other things and this and that. That's why we're having this meeting today, I guess. But I want some answers here. And if I can't get them from the answers from DOT, I'll go to the governor and ask the answers. But I want some answers to these questions, because our economy right now is terrible in the area that I represent. And we're looking for ways to boost it. And this is one of them, along with broadband. And I'm talking in a very parochial sense now but it's going to benefit so many others from Fitchburg West. Look at the areas that are growing there. Leominster, Fitchburg. Where's the next stop for Western Mass? Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. We appreciate your comments and your concerns as well. And as part of today's meeting, we wanted to bring these draft recommendations to both the working group and the public to get exactly that as your feedback. And each of the recommendations aims to advance this effort, whether it is looking at potential station stops, similar to what East West has done. You know, following the completion of that report, there's been work now to, you know, upgrade track in the Springfield and Worcester areas. There's been work to talk about where the stations would be in Palmer. So a lot of these pieces are being put together, and similarly to this process is how we've developed our recommendations. And I see a raised hand from Senator Comerford.
Thanks, Michaela. I think Rep. Blay may have her hand up before me, if that's true. I don't want to step on my sister.
You're all set. Go ahead.
Okay. So Michaela and Anna and Paul, thank you so much for this work. No one ever said that Northern Tier Rail would be easy. And it has been a long process, and I'm really, really grateful. What I would say is, you know, the West-East Rail from Pittsfield into Boston was impossible until it wasn't, friends. And then all of a sudden it was possible because the social and political will gelled. So I think our job is to find the way forward, those of us who really believe in the potential of this. So the question I have is, Michaela, when you looked at the work to be done, what I didn't see was planning work on the part of MassDOT to explore state and federal funding options. Unless I missed that and it went by too quickly, and that's my bad. But I guess I wonder about, what MassDOT is thinking in terms of the ability to actually bring this to fruition, in addition to the other kind of information that you have to collect. Is MassDOT going to be able to invest in this as a concept moving forward?
Yes, so thank you for that question. In terms of kind of funding sources, what we've outlined today kind of covers a few different buckets. So the first, as presented, were some of the federal grant options that might be available, as well as some of the state and local options as well. And this will all be documented in the draft final report as well. A little bit of information on each of these programs, where to get more information about these programs, and really, as Paul mentioned, starting to put some of these pieces together and come up with a plan of action in terms of what funding sources might be available for what parts and elements of the project itself. I next see a raised hand from Jackson.
That's wonderful. Can I just ask a follow-up question?
Yes, of course.
Oh, sorry, Michaela, can I just ask a quick follow-up question?
Most
Does
definitely.
that mean that MassDOT is going to push forward in exploring those funding potentials?
So as part of the recommended, or as part of the final report, it will document all of these funding options. And as this effort moves forward and there are, particular projects that come out of it, those funding strategies that have been researched and documented will then come into play. Jackson, I see a raised hand.
Yeah, thank you. Since I've already spoken, I want to make sure that no one else is in line to speak or would like to raise their hands before I go. Okay.
Don't see any other raised hands at the time.
Okay, great. Thank you. So yeah, a few questions and then I guess one comment. Have you made public or do you plan to make public the cost assumptions? I appreciate you breaking out cost per mile and per user, but some of these costs, to be entirely honest, seem a little high to me. So I was curious if you could share now or in the future just what standards those are based on. And then the other question I had is to what extent you've been in conversation with the Rail Transformation Office at the T, or more broadly, to what extent you've been looking at potential improvements on the Fitchburg to North Station segment, right? There's an RFI out for commuter rail transformation. There's going to be an operator rebid. There was talk about system-wide electrification, again, on commuter rail, and it seems like if you had Boston to Fitchburg electrified, even if you were running either off catenary on battery, as is going to happen on Fairmount this decade, or if you're running with diesel electric bi-modes, you'd see significantly reduced travel times and much lower O&M costs for the same marginal cost of this project. So I was curious if you thought about any of that.
Yes, thank you. So to your first question about costs, as part of the appendices of this study, that cost analysis will be included. And to your question about the Fitchburg to Boston segment, Anna or Paul, would you like to talk a little bit about how that came into play in this study?
Yeah, we did not assume we were making any improvements in this project to the MBTA Fitchburg line. However, for the electrification alternative, we did make the jump in the assumption that by the time this project is implemented, the MBTA would have electrified the Fitchburg line, and that any development of electrification on the northern tier would be compatible and consistent with what the MBTA had in mind. We have not had any direct interaction or coordination with the T on this project because it's fundamentally an intercity project under Mass DOT. But we have made those assumptions. So.
Yes, thank you. I see a raised hand from Representative Blake.
Hi, thanks so much, everybody, for this presentation. I'm going to try to wrap up some of the comments here that I've heard from my good colleagues, Rep. John Barrett and Senator Comerford. It was my understanding that when what you're proposing to us now comes out in a study, that the funding the legislature secured for this study is done. Like there's no more funding to do any more work on a study. So whatever you put out in this proposal is the final work. Am I correct in that?
Yes, so this study is looking at conceptual planning for the corridor, yes. And there is no additional funding for study at this time.
Okay. So you're going to put out these conceptual plans, and how would a decision be made as to what the best plan is to move forward? What does that look like? How does that happen?
So Anna, you might be able to speak a little bit more to this, but my understanding is that, based on all of the feedback we received and based on the analysis, alternatives 3 and 4 seem to kind of rise to the top. So those might be the ones that are advanced for further development. But Anna, could you speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah, that is true that alternatives 3 and 4 had the best measurements and metrics in terms of benefits and cost effectiveness. Largely because of the higher ridership that was attracted to these alternatives. So depending on how this is approached, when you look at the federal project approach, the chart that we saw earlier, Federal Railroad Administration does want you to have looked at all the alternatives. Environmental process requires that you have looked at alternatives. And then when you develop the, your preferred alternative or alternatives, then you can begin the further evaluation of those to determine, the impacts, at a more detailed level than we have in this study. So it then becomes, I'd say, a governance process whereby Mass DOT and the supporters of action determine what the preferred alternatives are and start to move those through whatever funding or planning process you're going to undertake. Some projects are 100% state, others have significant federal funds, but you have to follow whatever's process is, that you need in order to get the funds and to isolate the, in the end, the preferred alternative that you would end up building.
But the preferred, Anna, thank you for that. But the preferred alternative is something that the Commonwealth would need to address. It wouldn't be us applying for federal funds to further study the two alternatives that were put forward to determine what the best alternative is. That is something that the Commonwealth needs to do now to determine whether or not to then apply for federal funds that might be available.
Well, some federal funding programs will support that type of planning. But largely, yes, it is the Commonwealth's responsibility to determine the direction it wants to take.
Okay. And sorry, Michaela, is it okay if I just pursue this line of questioning? I just want to make sure we're clear as the slide is about next steps. And based on the governance study that was done, MassDOT would be the agency that would take this on in terms of determining what the next steps are. Well,
Mass DOT has the responsibility to administer these programs. However, I don't want to overspeak here, but the Mass DOT executes the policy decisions of the legislature and the governor. So
right, we just had a rail governance study that said that MassDOT should be the one to be overseeing rail development in Western Massachusetts. So,
but some fundamental, sorry.
No, go ahead.
But some fundamental decisions, are not necessarily those of Mass DOT. Once some decisions are made, then Mass DOT executes them. So.
Right, but I guess when we say those decisions, then I'm not clear on who's making those decisions.
So, Well, we have, if you assume we have two alternatives that have risen to the top, you know, both Massachusetts and federal, you know, planning processes require consensus from communities on projects. So Mass DOT doesn't make decisions unilaterally. They have to take input from the communities. So this study, you know, has taken input and has developed, you know, measurements and metrics that show benefits and costs. But the actual decisions on which way to proceed, Mass DOT needs to know and to be able to show funding, you know, federal government that we have a consensus behind the decision, behind the choice. So.
Right, but MassDOT would be the logical organization at this point in time to oversee that sort of analysis and determine what the next best step forward is before applying for federal funds.
True.
And I just want to make sure that I understand, if we were to apply for federal funds, that the cost benefit analysis that was done would be a hurdle to overcome. Since I think the CBI needs to be a 1.0 and the closest we have is negative 0.1. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. Does anybody remember, sorry for throwing this out there, what the CBI was for West East Rail? I feel like it was also low.
But there are different grants have different criteria, and most of the, you know, the major program grants require that BCI. I don't remember what theirs was, but some of the, as Paul had mentioned, some of these grant programs for discrete types of improvements, say for rail freight improvements, might be something that get funded without regard to the overall, you know, measurement. So,
yeah. Well, thank you. And I hope that I know we've talked about this a lot. There's a tremendous amount of excitement behind this project. Clearly, the ridership numbers are something to really be looked at. Those are really spectacular and really have the potential to turn around the economics in an area that has long struggled with economic development. And when I saw the difference in some of those home ownership, some of the home housing prices, you know, that alone could be incredibly impactful for the area. But I know, I think Senator Comerford had to step away, but I would be remiss if I did not just lift up the tremendous support that this project has behind it in the region and the tremendous potential that it has when we look at those population declines, when we look at housing costs, when we look at transportation options and us trying to meet our climate goals. There's just so much potential here. And I'm really hopeful that MassDOT will take this on quickly to determine the next steps in federal funding.
Thank you, Representative. I next see a raised hand from Representative Barrett.
Yes, just to follow up on Representative Blai's question. I just quote from some of the minutes or newspaper reports, and it said, and I quote, "We will, as part of this process, be looking at some funding opportunities," project manager Michaela Niles said in response to a question from Transportation for Massachusetts intern director Josh Ostroff, I believe. Yes. So this has been brought up before about the funding source. This was supposed to be part of the report, which was announced in December of 2021. And here we are, but we're going on almost 3 years of this. We're to the third year of this study that's going on here. And, you know, it just seems to be a big runaround. And as was in the bond issue that Representative Blais referred to, it states in there a money source being the Northern Tier Rail, as well as the other rails in there. It's right there in black and white, which should have been picked up on. I am just very concerned about how long this is taking and what's going on here and things that should have been answered by now. A report that said it would last 18 months is going back to December of 21. You know, we're along on this, and we've got to get some answers because things are not improving as far as getting this done. So plain and simple. I don't have a question, but it's just a feeling of frustration here that things have to start to happen, and this is crazy. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments, Representative, and to the the comment about funding. As part of this effort, we did look at some funding sources, again, looking at different levels of funding, whether it's federal, state, local, that in combination could address either in part or all of the development of this process. And I think as Anna or Paul mentioned, that some of these funding sources address planning and others address construction or a combination of the two. So in conjunction with all of these sources, there are elements that can be moved forward.
And there's $275 million for passenger service transportation for projects that are going on in the western part of the state. And there's only two of them that I'm really aware of that are, well, there's probably more. There's others, the flyer, and which I don't mean to dismiss by any stretch, but also that there's $275 million that's sitting there. And it states very clearly that that money can be used towards the Northern Tier project. That's all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other comments or questions from the working group at this time? Seeing no virtual hands, I think we will now open up the floor to public comment. So on the next couple of slides, we'll talk a little bit about how to participate. So on the next slide, we have a few ways to participate. If you'd like to submit a comment or question in writing, please continue to use the Q&A. And if you'd like to share a comment or question verbally, please use the raise hand button or dial *9 if you're participating by phone, and that will raise your virtual hand. We ask that you please share only one comment or question at a time and limit comments to 2 minutes to allow others to participate. We'd like to hear from as many people as we can about your thoughts ahead of the meeting's end at 2:30. And as a reminder, this is certainly not the only opportunity to comment or share your comments or questions. They can also be shared throughout the study process using the comment form on the study website. And so I see a couple of hands raised, but I know we have a couple of questions in the Q&A that I'll read first. So one question in the Q&A is from Andrew, who asks, if the Albany extension were implemented, would New York State be likely to contribute to construction costs? And Anna, you talked a little bit about kind of the coordination that would be needed. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Certainly. In intercity passenger rail projects, you have to get every state engaged and agreed to the service and as well as the actual construction, because the construction, typically the construction costs are going to be shared by each state. And under the rules that govern intercity passenger rail service, the operating costs are shared under formulas that have been developed by the various states that run these services. So if New York would definitely have to agree to both, the amount of service, what that service would cost, as any construction infrastructure improvements necessary to supply it. And this is something that Massachusetts has done before, working with Connecticut and Vermont to make the way for other intercity passenger rail services.
Thank you. And thank you for the question, Andrew. Another question in the Q&A comes from Frank, who asks, has any consideration been given to include a multi-use path along the rail line? Massachusetts law allows for multi-use paths around active rail lines and notes that this would enhance the quality of life in Franklin County and the North Quabbin. Anna, can you speak a little bit to that?
Certainly. Our focus on this study was the implementation of a passenger rail service. So we did not address something such as a multi-use trail. That doesn't preclude the possibility of that in the future, but this particular planning effort was focused on the rail service. And again, as I mentioned earlier, anything you do on a right-of-way has to be agreed upon by the owners as well as any partner states you might have. So Pan Am Southern, which is owned by CSX and Norfolk Southern, would have to agree to any other use of their property, such as a multi-use trail.
Thank you. I next see a raised hand from Andy. You should have a notification on your screen to unmute.
I am unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
First of all, thank you to the entire team for doing the work you did. It's, I share Brett Barrett's frustration, how long it takes, but I have no doubt that you're on this, so I appreciate it. my question is about economic benefits, which was one of the study goals. And I saw that there were short-term construction costs for the 3 or 4 years. And I saw that there were property values, but it seemed to me there should be more than that. I was wondering what else is on your agenda for doing this? The motivation, as many have said, is to promote economic development, promote population growth. And I just didn't see that much in here. So I was curious, are you going to be doing more detailed work on economic benefits by broadening the scope of topics, or is that something which is going to happen some other day down the road? Thank you.
Thank you. Paul, I believe that was part of your section of the presentation. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I'm gonna ask Price to contribute too, because he was leading that. So Michaela, as long as you can make sure he can speak too. But the idea here is that as I mentioned, the primary vehicle we looked at for economic benefits was both the kind of construction impacts and then also the benefits to having people travel on the rail service, and that was using the guidelines of the BCA. We kind of are trying to highlight other potential benefits, but they are not as quantifiable as the BCA calculations. So we do want to kind of raise those issues as potential benefits, but it's much harder to get it onto an agreed upon number. And Price and maybe Jacob, if you want to, could you kind of cover how we could potentially look at that in more detail in additional studying?
Yeah, I'll start. So yes, absolutely. We were primarily looking at it through the framework of the benefit cost analysis. I mean, to the previous discussion, that's one of the key frameworks for pursuing federal funding. So that is certainly the focus, especially for moving this forward. But we did talk a lot internally about alternative lenses or frameworks to look at induced economic development, such as the potential for additional employment. So Devon's in particular was an interesting industrial model that we looked at, the decommissioned Air Force Base kind of northwest of Boston, and the really significant industrial investments and growth and employment there. So we had an interview with them, again, qualitatively looking at it. We also were looking kind of like, I guess I would say, again, qualitatively at some of the topographical and other logistical issues with a growing population. So we mentioned sort of needed investments in schools. How would housing and zoning work out in terms of population growth? So I would say we certainly did a lot of qualitative work on what economic and population growth would look like, in addition to the real estate value work that UMass Donahue Institute that Jacob can speak a little bit more to. But that's correct. The main quantitative focus was using the benefit cost analysis framework. I think partially because it's very important to pursuing federal funding, and it's very well defined. And I don't know, Jacob, if you have any additional thoughts.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jacob Harrington. I work with the UMass Donahue Institute. We assisted with some of these economic benefits. Yeah, I would say, I mean, that all basically covers it. And just that kind of what Price was saying about the qualitative aspects of some of these benefits exist, but they're difficult to quantify. Certainly when uncertainty is taken into account, redevelopment around train stations can have to do with zoning at the town level. That's, changes can happen in the years after service starts that are difficult to kind of quantify. But I think that basically accounts for, the changes in what to expect and kind of what goes into that calculation.
Thanks, Jacob. Thanks, Price. Andy, I hope that gets to at least some answers to your question.
Thank you. I next see a raised hand from Carl. You should have a notification on your screen to unmute. Carl, we can't hear you. You should have a notification on your screen to unmute.
There we go. I think that got it. I don't have a question. I have a comment. I'll try to keep it to the 2 minutes. One of the fundamental flaws, I think, in this study is at the west end of the line, which is that your terminus should not be North Adams, although it certainly could be the servicing point. It should be Williamstown. You have very important tourist draws there with the Clark Museum and the Williams College Museum and with Williams College itself. While a motor coach connection could be provided, that's going to be 20 minutes or more longer than the train, and that will self-exclude a substantial amount of your ridership. Similarly, I think cost-benefit analysis would look better if you took into account possible connectivity from the north, from Vermont, and particularly passengers in the Connecticut Valley who might wish to reach Boston quicker than going all the way down to Springfield. That could be a significant market. I ran a business in Brattleboro and in Vermont in general for over 30 years that did rail as its sole focus. And we had so many calls for Boston service that it's almost impossible to count them. But because of the elapsed running time, it was impractical. The Boston and Maine ran Brattleboro to Boston dedicated trains until about 1949. This is an area where I think you have a real market that could be of benefit to you. Similarly, I think, although it's important, obviously, to look at equipment costs, it's also consequential to know that in the next 2 or 3 years, Amtrak will be retiring over 400 of its Amfleet 1 coaches. They aren't relatively new, but they are very strong, powerful, and good equipment, still usable. And finally, you have the opportunity at Boston to connect to the rest of the MBTA commuter network for long distance riders and also to the Downeaster. And if at some point in the future it should become possible to go to Albany, Vermont also has recently submitted and been funded for a preliminary analysis of restoring passenger service from Burlington to Albany as a second train going via Bennington and Hoosick Junction. And that would potentially give you connectivity at the west end of this line as well. Overall, I applaud this effort. I hope you proceed with it. I think it's important and I think it should be done, but I strongly urge you to consider the possibility of having the western terminus be Williamstown. Equipment could deadhead back to North Adams for the night very quickly and easily, but you're passing up a potential strong market for both tourists and college travel, and I think that is a serious error.
Thank you for your comments, Carl. Much appreciated. So in terms of kind of the terminus of the process, I'll talk a little bit about that, and then Paul, maybe have you talk about a little bit about the connections that were explored as part of this study that also speak to one of the questions that we have in the Q&A. But in terms of kind of the study framework and the study kind of scope, rather, the legislation that this study was based on directed Mass DOT to conduct a feasibility study of rail access between the cities of North Adams and Boston, which is how we kind of started as our process of developing the alternatives. Certainly, as the study continued, we certainly heard about places like Albany and other stops that were incorporated into this process. So that kind of gives a little bit of background on why North Adams was considered to be the terminus for the majority of the alternatives. And so, Paul, I'll turn it over to you after I kind of read one of the questions in the Q&A as well from Andrew, who asks about the Albany connector and says, does the Albany connector estimated ridership number factor in visitors who might come to the Berkshires from New York City and Albany? So to Carl's comments and to Andrew, can you talk a little bit about the connections that were included as part of the analysis?
Sure. I guess as far as the general, going a little bit back to how we put these ridership estimates together, is it's primarily based on the underlying population and employment numbers, but also the data we were able to get from location-based services data, where we took, working with Price and his team, looked at trips throughout the year within the corridor that kind of gelled around the different station locations. So that was something that was able to capture trips of all kinds, but we did have to distill it down to kind of a standard day. So I would say, we weren't capturing necessarily the peaks, but we also weren't capturing the valleys in the ridership in the corridor. And I'll just say that this study area did incorporate Williamstown. We used a license that Mass DOT has for location-based services, which covers the entire Commonwealth and then a certain buffer around it, which encapsulates some of the Albany region, but I wouldn't say it encapsulates the whole part. So it was a little bit of a limited data set that was available for this to look at the ridership. So it incorporates trips in New York at least within the borders of Massachusetts, within proximity to the borders of Massachusetts. It does not capture New York City ridership that may come up and transfer to it. It does not cover that. This is primarily looking at the east to west connections in Massachusetts and kind of their follow-on effects there. So that is not included here. And I think was there something else to the original question that I missed, Michaela, or is that was the idea there, is that we use location-based services as the underlying information. So it did capture to the point about Williamstown. I think what we did find is that adding stations along the line did increase the ridership predictions because even though a place like Williamstown is in the catchment area that we're looking at, what we saw is that the closer a station is to those people, more of them are likely to be attracted to the station. So, this is by no means the be all end all of all the potential station locations. And so, some sort of variant that has a Williamstown station could be looked at, or the potential benefits of that could be looked at as well.
Thank you, and thank you for those questions. I next see a raised hand from Joe. You should have a notification on your screen to unmute.
Hi, I'm Joe Carland. I live in Coleraine. First of all, I want to thank everybody for their work on this project. I think it's really essential. I agree with Representative Barrett that this should have happened yesterday. As soon as this meeting is over, I'm driving my son for an hour and 20 minutes to drop him off at Wachusett to take the train into Boston. Then I have to drive home. If I could drive him to Boston, to Greenfield, that would be a half hour each way. If I were to drive him to Shelburne Falls, that would be 15 minutes each way. A great savings of time and vehicle miles. So I think the full local service, including service to Williamstown, is really important. So thank you all.
Thank you, Joe. We appreciate you being here, and we appreciate everyone for being here and sharing your comments, your questions, your concerns with us as well. I see a question in the Q&A from Paula, who asks, what will it take for Northern Tier to be added to the Compass Rail schematic? So Anna, you talked a little bit about kind of the Compass Rail effort, and I will say that the Compass Rail effort is an evolving effort, and as Northern Tier progresses, it may be added to that process. So thank you, Paula, for sharing that. And I next see a question from Jim, who asks, what would ridership have to be in order to get the ratio to 1? So Paul, can you talk a little bit about, I know you talked a little bit about kind of phasing, and that's also one of the draft recommended next steps, is looking at phasing and alternative implementation strategies. But can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I guess in terms of ridership that would need to be added to get to a cost benefit cost ratio of 1, it would have to be significantly higher. You are correct. And I think that, but the other thing too, I think more to Michaela's start to the answer, is that, these services don't necessarily have to come out of the box as a full service from North Adams to Greenfield to Boston. There are opportunities to grow awareness and interest in travel by train in the corridor. As many of you said, there's a lot of interest in this, so maybe we could find, you've seen the Commonwealth willing to support flyer services, down to Cape Cod and through Berkshire, through Albany to Pittsfield as well. So there are ways to maybe look into that, negotiate for weekend-oriented trains or things like that, that will all be considered, I think, as part of our implementation plan and recommendations. And there's a lower, you can kind of play on both sides, right? For a BCA, you can play on the cost, the benefit side to the people riding, and the cost side. So introducing a service that's less frequent, has less coverage area, would cost less. So you can see better benefit cost ratios with lower ridership. And so something like that might be the place to start if you're seeking that BCA of 1. Michaela, does that cover what you wanted? Yeah, okay.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the question. I next see a question from Dave, who asks, why not have commuter rail employees run the service? Why contract with Amtrak when the state already has a dedicated commuter rail workforce? So Anna, you talked a little bit about kind of the intercity versus commuter aspect. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, there are two different types of of passenger rail services. One is intercity, one is commuter rail. And commuter rail is essentially what you have on the T, which is a high frequency, peak oriented service of equipment that's not maybe it's not the most comfortable, but it's enough for a short ride to work in the morning. You have peak oriented service toward generally, Boston. Whereas intercity service is a service that has fewer stops, greater distances between stops, has a less frequent service. It's not oriented toward peak necessarily, and it's not, the MBTA has almost 500 trains a day. That's not, what intercity is, a sort of basic level of service that connects communities that are not necessarily as dense or as closely located together. So when you're looking at how the federal government looks at passenger rail services, Northern Tier clearly falls into the intercity range and not into the commuter range. And Amtrak is currently the operator of intercity passenger rail service in this country. And because they have the right of access to rights of way, including the MBTA, including, Pan Am Southern, there's an overwhelming advantage to looking at Amtrak as the operator, both because of its experience and its statutory advantage.
Thank you. And thank you for the question. I know we're running a little bit low on time, but there is one additional question / comment that I see in the Q&A from Ben, who says, thank you for this opportunity to engage in the process and is curious in what ways the business community has been engaged, and mentions that between workforce, tourism, and hybrid employment opportunities, the opportunities go far beyond what a pure number analysis would present. So thank you, Ben, for sharing that. And I think Paul and has talked a little bit about some of the qualitative work that's been done. So Paul or Anna, can you talk a little bit about how, in addition to having members of the business community on this working group, how kind of economic development has been looked at through the process and could be looked at going forward?
Well, I think as we've said, we took a look at the impacts on businesses, which can be measured through the induced employment and economic impacts during the actual construction phase. And as Price said, we've had conversations with development agencies and others about, how this works and how it could be qualitatively help justify an enhanced rail service. But I think the main participation has been through this working group and, throughout the life of the project.
Only thing I would add, Michaela, is, we did a lot of thinking about, what people who would relocate to the area because of the rail transportation would likely do. And one of the things that we realize, and part of why it's in kind of our findings, is that most people who would relocate, say they worked in the Boston area and want to relocate out to the corridor because housing is less expensive. Part of them doing that would mean that they probably wouldn't travel to Boston every day, right? That's what most people would prefer to do, is to work remotely, but still have that access to Boston. And so, that in that situation, you're kind of seeing the migration out that's kind of desired, but it's not being reflected in the ridership that you'd see, right? The true thing that drives high ridership numbers is people living in an area and commuting every day into work and out. And so there you almost have a disconnect. Almost it's related what I've heard, from like the snow and ice clearance. Right now that the storms in Massachusetts are less snowy, we still need the equipment because it's actually icy. So your snow accumulation isn't a true measure of the effort needed. And so that's why one of the things I think we would recommend looking into is when, even you're kind of getting that benefit to the community of that worker relocating, but you're not seeing it in the ridership. So what other metrics could you potentially factor in outside of the traditional kind of rigid BCA analysis to do that kind of work.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing that, Ben. We appreciate your comments and we appreciate everyone's comments, questions, and concerns that you shared with us today. So I think moving to the next portion of the presentation, I think we'll move to some of the kind of next steps in the process. So as many of you may know, we are holding a public meeting next week. We already have over 200 people registered. So please, if you haven't registered already, please think about attending if you're able to. And we will be presenting these draft recommendations at that meeting. And based on the feedback received today and at next week's meeting, we will continue to develop these recommended next steps. And as I mentioned a bit earlier, the study process will be documented in a draft final report, which will be released for public comment and then finalized in a final report. And a notification will be sent out once the draft final report has been released. So please sign up for updates on the study website if you haven't already. So now moving to the next slide. With that, thank you all for being here today and for your participation. I encourage you to visit the study website to share any additional comments or questions or feedback using the comment form. The materials from this meeting will be included, including the video recording, will be made available on the study website. And so with that, this concludes today's meeting. Thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you next week at the public meeting and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.